All right, this is the capstone lesson, kind of bringing this all together for the unit. Topic 8.7 Kings, Limits, and the Rise of Nation States. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain how royal power changed and how new ideas about the law, representation in government, and national identity shaped authority in medieval Europe. These are all key ideas that are going to really keep growing into the next couple units, so it's important you understand where this begins. So we're going to really be talking about what's going on kind of in this chunk of the timeline here. We're going to be ending with the 100 Years' War. The bubonic plague is going on at the beginning of this. The Magna Carta we're going to talk about, which is, about a century before that. So we're kind of jumping around a little bit, but we're in the latter half of the medieval Europe. And this will kind of end where our European Renaissance unit is going to begin. So there's going to be some overlap in these units, but just generally things going on around the world at the time of the events we're talking about in this lesson. Mansa Musa is going on his Hajj to Mecca. The Swahili city-states on the east coast of Africa are dominating trade in the monsoon marketplace. The Yuan dynasty is going strong, is founded and is going strong over in China. The Crusades, right, are kind of ending around this period of time. The Islamic Golden Age is ending around this period of time. So there's a lot going on in the rest of the world at the time of these events are happening. It's important to ground yourself because we're not telling the story completely chronologically. It just wouldn't make sense if we did everything completely in timeline order. So there's a lot of overlap. So I want to make sure you understand that there's all these other things going on around the world in different parts of the world during the same time these events are happening in Western Europe. So in previous lessons, we've already seen these major stressors on the systems that are holding Europe together, right? The Crusades, the bubonic plague, massive population growth, swelling of urbanization as people are moving to the towns, power shifting from land-based to money-based. These are big changes that are challenging the structural integrity of these systems that have kept Europe stable for so long. So as these crises are happening, the feudal bonds that are holding people together, right? The idea that I, the peasant and serf, am going to work for the lords, give them food, in exchange they're going to protect us and give us a place to live and work on their land, on their manor. That's really starting to weaken, right? This loyalty and obligation to those above you on the hierarchy and those below you, owing something to them, that's starting to really break down. The plague is bringing massive population loss. Constant warfare, whether it's the Crusades or other wars, are also causing problems. And then there's the economic strain, as now there's these financial centers of power in towns that are starting to rival the land-based power of nobility. The church is still remaining powerful, but people are starting to question it because, the plague seems to be this punishment from God, and the church is unable to stop it, and even the clergy is falling victim to it. And they promised that Europeans would win the Crusades against the Muslims. However, they lose these Crusades repeatedly. So people are starting to kind of question their authority due to these major missteps. And so that belief-based system, it's a strength that held them together. But now, once you start questioning the role of the church in this, that's a real structural vulnerability. At the same time, the other pillar of strength and stability in this medieval period, the kings, are facing their own pressure to govern larger and larger territories more effectively, right? They're no longer these tiny kingdoms, but they're starting to coalesce, right? The Kingdom of France is getting bigger. England's kingdom is getting bigger. It absorbed Wales. Hungary, where the Magyars were kind of also burgeoning as a massive power. Lithuania, Poland, don't even start about the Holy Roman Empire, which is, as you can see, not really a single unified empire by all the different colors here representing different spheres of power. And so these rulers are trying to find a way to govern these large territories effectively, and they don't have the bureaucracy in place that the Romans had that helped them, keep control over this. So the old system is based on personal loyalty to those below and above you on the social hierarchy, and based on belief systems of religion, are no longer enough to make people feel like this system is stable, and so things are going to start changing. The kings begin to really centralize power here. They attempt to restore order after centuries of fragmentation. These tiny little kingdoms have popped up all over what used to be the Western Roman Empire, and now kings are starting to bring these together into larger territories. Royal authority is expanding beyond these personal relationships with nobles. We saw this with the idea of getting a lot of taxes from the merchant class in the urban town centers. And so while personal loyalty and obligations was great for a long period of time, as territories are getting larger and more complex, that old, relationship-based system isn't really working anymore. It's not functioning for these large territories. So the kings began to appoint royal judges that would travel around the kingdom, and they would enforce the laws. You can see images of these judges kind of going around here, and you can see it's kind of a trial-like situation. They're reading over the laws, and they're trying to decide who's guilty, who's innocent, what the punishment should be, based on the laws handed down from the king. And justice is increasingly seen as something that's coming from the crown, right? These laws and dictates of the king are determining, what is fair, what's justice, punishing criminals. That used to be something local lords were in charge of in the feudal system, but now people are looking to the kings for this. So you're seeing them consolidate more of the power of the lords into themselves. And this law really becomes an effective tool for governing people directly instead of just managing the elites of the nobility. It's the king can use these laws to kind of get the people of their kingdoms to feel like they're actually connected to their king, especially if the laws are fair, if people feel justice is being served. They're no longer going to feel that obligation to obey their lords because the lords really aren't providing that stability anymore. This is coming directly from the king, increasing their power. Of course, if these judges were imposing unfair taxes or weren't being fair in their decisions on justice, then people are going to take that out on the kings because, after all, they're the ones at the top, they're the ones assigning the judges. And so you can kind of see, again, how there's this stability built in, but also some vulnerability into the system. These large centralized governments are going to be very expensive. They require a lot of money. They have to pay for the officials. The judges want a salary. The armies want to be paid for this. So they need to find another source of money to pay for all this to keep this larger government working. Warfare also is becoming longer and larger at this time, much more expensive. Wars used to be kind of these quick things that were settled fairly quickly, and now they're becoming very, very long, and so you have to sustain armies for a long period of time. Kings are no longer able to rely on, feudal obligations of like, well, when I need you, I'm going to call upon a lord who's going to bring their knights to help serve me in this battle against a rival kingdom. That's kind of breaking apart at this point. It's not enough to keep the system going. So the kings start to create taxes as a way to fund wars and fund this large administrative process. However, people hate paying taxes. That is a common theme throughout history. I work hard and have to give a chunk of my earnings to the government. Well, that never seems fair. So they're forced to raise taxes on the clergy, on towns, on the nobility. However, these people have their own spheres of power, right? The nobles, they do have their own power base. They control large groups of knights. The clergy, as we talked about, the Catholic Church, they have their own power base, their own forms of authority. And towns, right, also, we talked about this in previous lesson, have their own power structure there and their own sources of authority and legitimacy. And so kings, they could just say, pay me these taxes, but that doesn't mean they're going to get paid. So this requires kings to start to negotiate with the nobles, with the clergy, with the towns, in order to make sure those taxes are being paid, because force alone isn't going to do it. One of the key moments here is that the nobles in England in particular, they don't like the kings during the Crusades demanding more and more taxes from the nobility without the nobles getting a say, right? The nobles say, if you're going to tax us, we want to say in what those taxes are. This leads to a huge struggle. We're going to talk a little bit more about it in a future unit. But essentially, it ends up with the king signing a document known as the Magna Carta. And this is a very important document because the Magna Carta is basically an agreement between the kings and the nobles saying that the nobles have certain rights and they have to be allowed a seat at the table when it comes to deciding what the taxes are. Essentially, this becomes the beginning of, if you're going to tax us, then we need to get a say. We need to be allowed to have a say in what the taxes are. You're also going to see some things in the Magna Carta that should sound very familiar, right? Like saying that if the government's going to accuse you of something, they have to have a credible witness present to testify to it. You can't be imprisoned or killed by the government unless you're deemed to have broken the law by a group of your peers or by the law of the land. It can't be random. It has to be based on law and juries. Justice cannot be bought. Everyone has an equal right to justice. These are ideas that might sound familiar because the Magna Carta really is the beginning of those stepping stones that will eventually lead to the American Declaration of Independence and the American Constitution centuries later. So this is a thread we're going to come back to. But the key, most important thing you need to remember about the Magna Carta here is that this is the beginning of a limitation, a legal limitation on kings. So they're no longer allowed to do whatever they want just because they're king. There are legal limits. Essentially, it says the king is beholden to the law just like everyone else. That's a really important idea, as royal authority is finally being limited in some way, at least here in England. So, as I said, royal authority becomes subject to rules and agreements. Like, they can't just do whatever they want; they have to follow the rules. And there's representative bodies start to get put together. Right, the nobles at the beginning, like elections, really aren't that big of a thing, but nobility at least gets to meet and then vote to approve taxes and advise the king. This was known as Parliament. So, well, the common people really didn't have a say. The nobility, the higher nobles and lesser nobles, the knights, they did have some say, and they would be brought together in this thing called a parliament, where they could vote on taxes and other things. And again, a way to limit the king's power, requiring the consent of at least the elites in society before those things can be put into place. So again, you're seeing this thread that's going to continue to evolve until we eventually get to the American government system. This was not just happening in England. In France, we saw something similar with the Estates General playing a very similar role. The Estates General is going to play a very big role when we get to the French Revolution coming up in a couple units, so we're going to file that away, another thread we're going to come back to. But both the Parliament and Estates General reflect this idea that there is negotiation between the king and his subjects. They're not equal, but the king does have to negotiate with his subjects before he's able to completely enforce his will upon them. And so they do get some say, and that's important. It's during this period you see the birth of early national identity. We call this kind of a proto-nationalism or an early nationalism. Nationalism is this idea of being extremely loyal to your country of origin or the culture and people that you come from. You see this a lot with like waving flags. That's an example of nationalism, or the idea that, oh, our country is better than every other country. That's a nationalist idea. And this really begins around this period. Part of the cause of this is loyalty shifting from the local lords to a single crown, a single king, right? The people start to identify not with their local lord, but this overarching idea of a single king ruling over people with a common identity. So people began to see themselves as part of a kingdom, not just a small feudal manor, but a large kingdom, and the one thing that unites them is a shared language, culture, history, and especially a single king. And so we get this idea of nationalism beginning to develop out of this. That's another theme that's going to keep running through the rest of these lessons, moving through the rest of the semester. Nationalism, its rise, its impacts, and the dangers of it. So stay with me. Kings began to claim that their authority came from the fact that they were rulers of a people, not just they owned a lot of land, right? Previously, kings got their power because they owned all the land, and then they divided up amongst the nobles, who then divided up amongst lesser nobles, who then had these manors that, the peasants and serfs worked on. And so, I am king because I control the land because God wants me to. Instead, this starts to shift. This is the idea that the land should be ruled over by a king that represents the people of that land. So political legitimacy, the idea that I, believe that this government has the right to tell me what to do, increasingly comes not from the fact that the king owns all the land or necessarily from the fact that God wants this person to be king. That's all still part of this, but it also becomes tied to this idea that we all have this shared identity, that we are all members of the same nation, whether that's the English, the French, or whatever it is. So kings are beginning to get this third area of authority to justify their rule over the people. Right? So authority of the kings is now justified not just by religious belief or the military force, but this idea of belonging, the idea that we all belong to a single nation. We start to see flags representing people, just like the king is supposed to be a representation of the people of the land, right? Nation means people with a shared culture, history, language from a shared land. And so the kings really are supposed to be the living embodiment of this, and that is a source of authority and justification of their power as well. One event that really kickstarts a lot of this, at least according to a lot of historians, is a period known as the 100 Years' War. This is a war that lasted on and off for, you guessed it, about 100 years. It wasn't constant fighting for all 100 years, like there'd be periods of peace, but essentially the same conflict was fought over a century. The English kings, they claimed to operate England, they claimed that they deserved to be the kings of France because, there were some family ties. Remember, monarchies, it's about, the son gets to be king after the father. Well, if there is no son, then you have to go back in the lineage and decide, figure out who's going to be the next ruler. And essentially, the King of England said, because of this family member of mine passed, I get to be the King of France as well as the King of England. And the French nobles across this land said, well, but you're not French, you're English, you speak a different language, you're from a different land. We don't want you in charge of the French people and the French land. And so this becomes a conflict between England and France that is about who gets to rule over the French people. Should it be the English king because of some family member in the past, or should the French people be able to pick and have their own king who represents their own culture, history, and language, and all of that? And so this really starts to intensify this idea of a national identity and the king representing a single people. This constant warfare really intensifies the need for kings to tax in order to support armies and really have enough money to build this central authority to keep control over these large lands. This shared suffering, shared taxation, this shared struggle over who gets to be in charge really does start to create these national identities where people start to think of themselves as the French people or the English people. And so this is where we start to see rulers increasingly justifying their power as defending the nation, defending the people with a shared history. And by the end, right, this war starts in 1337. By the time it ends in around 1453, you have the borders of France look roughly like what it is today, and the borders of England is roughly what it looks like today. And so this is kind of the birth of these modern, what we call nation states, governments based on a people with a shared culture, history, traditions, and whatnot. In this conflict, we got an interesting case study, Joan of Arc, right? Joan is a famous French figure. She claimed that she had this direct line of communication with God, and that God was commanding her to lead the French army against the English and to help support the French claim to their own throne, to their own kingdom. A lot of French people really like this because, right, this is supporting this idea that they're separate. However, you can guess the Catholic Church did not like this, because after all, the Catholic Church's power comes from the fact that they are the intermediaries between the people and God. God doesn't speak directly to the common people. He speaks to the Pope, and the Pope, through the hierarchy, then issues those and through canon law down to the regular people. Joan claims that God was speaking to her and that God said that the French should be separate, have their own king, and they should follow her into battle. This linked religious belief to loyalty to the idea of France as a separate nation and starts to help legitimize French resistance against the English rule over them. The dispute between England and France, right, today we think of them as allies, but actually for most of their history, they did not like each other. And the Catholic Church did not like Joan of Arc. In the end, neither did England. In the end, Joan was captured by the English. She was put on trial, accused of heresy, that is, saying things that were the contrary to what the Catholic Church was teaching. And as a result, she was convicted and then burned alive by the Catholic Church. This really was this system of authority, right? The church saying that their power comes from their ability to communicate with God. They were protecting this in this trial. After all, if a common person like Joan could speak to God and God was speaking to everyone, then why would people need to listen to the Catholic Church? So this trial was really a way of the church defending its own power base, and the fact that the English crown went along with it was also a way to help support and protect their own source of legitimacy, their own political power. But in the end of the day, Joan was burned alive as a heretic because she dared to claim that God spoke to her instead of speaking only to the Pope. Joan's story really does demonstrate how religious belief can both empower and threaten a political system. After all, right, it is your belief in your religious faith in Western Europe of the Catholic Church that supports the idea of why you are being ruled over by a king, because you believe that God wants that king in charge, because God speaks to the Pope, and the Pope said the king's in charge. But if your religious belief starts to be that God is speaking to you directly, and you're that strong a believer in this faith, then that can be a threat to this whole system as well, which is based on you obeying and following the orders of those higher up on you in the social hierarchy. Okay, so why does all this matter? It's because political authority at this time is no longer being based only on force or belief alone, right? We've been looking at this in the feudal system, medieval period. I'm in charge because I have more violence than you, or I'm in charge because God wants me in charge. But now this new idea of why a king is in charge starts to develop, and kings begin to gain their own strength outside of this, dependent on law, taxation, and a national identity as a source of their power. The church is still going to be influential, but is increasingly being contested, challenged by outside ideas, and that's another thread we're really going to follow. And early nation states are starting to form with built-in strengths and vulnerabilities of their own, right? A nation state is a government based on a people of shared history, language, and culture. And so this is a new way of forming governments and, arguing for why that government is legitimate. And it's going to have its own strengths. But just like all these other systems that we're looking at, it's going to have its own built-in vulnerabilities that in a time of crisis are going to be challenged, and something new is going to come out of that. Looking ahead, we're going to see how these challenges to authority, both religious and political authority, are going to continue to grow. Individuals and ideas are increasingly going to question who should be in charge. And eventually, these tensions are going to set the stage for major world events. The Renaissance, the Reformation, and eventually the Age of Revolutions that will lead to the birth of the United States. So our anchor question I want to leave you with, to leave you thinking about, is that if political authority depends on your religious belief, if it depends on law and national identity, what happens when people begin to challenge who has the right to rule them? What's going to happen to this system? And that's where we're going to leave it. That's the end of the unit. Take a moment, rewrite the goal, type out 3 facts, complete thoughts, complete ideas, type it out, don't copy and paste, and then write 1 question for me that you still have. When we come back to class, we're going to be doing some review, we're going to play some review games, and get you ready for that unit assessment. If you have any questions, reach out. But until then, I'll see you in class.